The idea that a woman would regret sleeping with someone and then the best thing they can do is cry rape rather than just not telling anyone. Like in a modern day and age where women have autonomy over their sexuality, where we're in a dating age and there's choices to be made, it doesn't even make rational sense that someone would do that just because they regret sleeping with someone.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week was born in Australia and became a human rights lawyer before deciding that she would rather be a playwright and moving to London. And her most successful work to date is Prima Facie, which starred Jodie Comer in the London stage and has won lots of awards and has now been turned into a novel as well, and is a very hard-hitting story of a young barrister who works the system, who defends men accused of rape and confuses witnesses and gets men acquitted until she herself finds herself a victim of rape and going through the system. The play itself has led to all sorts of changes in the way the law is applied in this country and abroad, and you really have kind of changed the world in this respect.
Well, you know, it's exciting because you think as a lawyer I should be changing the world, but it actually happened when I was a playwright.
What wasn't good enough about the law for you?
I actually loved the law and I was in court every day. I worked as a human rights lawyer. I also did criminal cases for young people under 25 who had lots of complicated issues. And I found that when I was in court that I realised that my way of storytelling was something that had more effect than my kind of manipulation of the law, so to speak. So the way I described a client who was being put into prison or into a sentencing situation was I would give the narrative of their life story and show what they'd been through and how the state had not actually supported them, and actually appeal to the judge that this is one opportunity where they could be diverted from a jail system and be given an opportunity. And I realised that I was different to other lawyers in that regard, and that maybe my best skill set was actually storytelling.
So it wasn't that wasn't working?
No, it wasn't. It was definitely working, but it was one person at a time. And
yes.
I felt like I wanted to tell stories to a lot of people and not just at dinner parties and one person at a time in court. So often I'd go to dinner parties and tell the stories of my court days, and everyone would be like, oh, that's a really awful case, God. And my husband would say, enough. And everyone stops talking because it's like so dramatic. And I thought, yeah, but it's my daily life. And then I thought I wrote my first play about that job. And it had such a profound effect. And I had some feedback from individuals that made me realise that possibly 500 people a night being, I guess, cajoled into seeing something in a certain way actually allowed for bigger change than just me talking to a judge each day.
I mean, we're going through a phase of fashion at the moment in TV drama particularly, yes, where people are going, oh, you know, drama is an amazing way to look at real issues, as if this is like a sort of a new revelation because of the post office scandal, I suppose.
I know, which is an amazing thing that, you know, a TV show goes on and people go, oh, now I get what was happening.
Yeah, but that was always, that's what drama's done.
That's exactly what drama's done.
The start of time.
Yes, it is. It is. And I mean, I didn't grow up with drama. I didn't grow up even with the law. I grew up in a family that wasn't educated, and we didn't do things like go to the theatre. So it was my own personal discovery of theatre that made me think, oh, this is something that appeals to me no end. And so I went back to university while I was a lawyer and did a master's in theatre and film, and went to NIDA, which is like RADA here, where they have a playwrights course. So that was how I sort of embarked upon it, thinking I'd do both for most of my days, and then really I had to choose at a certain point.
And why theatre, specifically as a medium?
Really good question, but I think I just naturally felt I think mainly lawyers are often frustrated actors / drama kind of ways of thinking about drama and how you present yourself and how you provide a narrative to the court. So it just was a natural progression for me. I think the magic of theatre and the suspension of disbelief, and also the idea of theatre as something that grapples with ideas. It's not just storytelling. At the base of a story is an idea that gets wrapped up in a story, that the audience fall in love with the characters or the story, and then they come to realise an idea by actually sticking with that story and investing in it.
So I gave a sort of very bad sort of summary of what Prima Facie is about, but
No, you didn't at all.
You give me your version and how it came about.
Okay, so when I was at law school, I was doing feminism in the law and gender in the law, as well as the usual subjects. So when I did criminal law, I actually thought this is really odd. Like there's something about this that's a bit amiss, because I really understand defence law. I was a defence lawyer, criminal defence lawyer, because the idea of innocence until proven guilty is everything to me. But when it came to sexual assault and rape law, you realise that actually what happens is the prosecution case is based on the complainant, who's a woman that stands up in court, gives their testimony, and is then the way to undermine that testimony is to find all the reasons why they're lying or why their story doesn't make sense. And what the woman has to prove is not just that they weren't consenting to what happened, but the person who is being accused knew that they weren't consenting. But what we sort of miss is that it comes from years and years of established law that's based on the experience of white, very privileged, very wealthy, and men from certain backgrounds, very privileged backgrounds, where they don't have the perspective or lived experience of someone other than themselves in any manner. And so basically the whole idea of women as being chattels of men, and then right up until the 90s of last century, you could not rape your wife because once they'd consented to marriage, they were basically consenting to sex for the rest of their life at the whim of their partner. So that's what we're basing our sexual assault and rape laws on. That's the extension of it, is that somehow or other, that once you say yes to something, that it's not a retractable option, and that how could any man ever have to deal with the fact that someone might change their mind?
And the way to unpick somebody's truth is to pick little holes.
Well,
in their
that's what we're
recollection.
trained to do as lawyers. I mean, I've done that myself millions of times. I haven't done sexual assault law because I didn't do it. But, obviously the way to do it in the adversarial system is to cross-examine a witness to make out that they're mistaken or they're lying or they haven't really got a good grasp of the truth or their identification is wrong. And when you do that to a woman who's a complainant, what happens is mostly over the years it's been male barristers, because there's been no women barristers until relatively recently. But it's put to them that they're crying rape because they regret having slept with someone, or because they want to punish someone, or just because they want to have a drama around them. Now, I actually took 6 sexual assault statements a week when I was a lawyer from young women who were applying to the Victims' Compensation Tribunal to have funds to provide therapy. So there was no real motivation to lie other than to get therapy about sexual assault. And the stories I heard 6 times a week were all the same. And it shocked me because they had the same they'd say, I froze, I didn't know what to do, or their memories of some of the peripheral pieces of evidence were quite blurry, but they knew who did it and what happened to them. But when you take that story and re-narratize it in court, it's a very different testimony. And then you start to undermine it and look at it with derision, basically, or with this idea that there's no way that could be true because it doesn't fit the story that the defence lawyer has. And you start to see the unravelling of the story, even though the first presentation of it was completely believable and there was no reason for them to lie.
And you then understand why so many women who go through that process
Absolutely.
say it's like an assault all over again.
And also the other thing is, of course, that the place of the crime is actually the woman's body. So that person then stands up in court sometimes 3 years later, and as we know, justice delayed is justice denied. So they have to think about it for 3 years, constantly asked if it's worth going through with. And sometimes it's not. And as I say in the book, some of the statistics is that 1 in 3 women probably experience sexual violence in their lifetime at least. And out of the ones that go to the police, very few of them go to court, and out of the ones that go to court, there's a 1.3% conviction rate. So something's not working with the system. And I think what's happened is it's a very gendered system. And in the same way that in other parts of the law, like gender, race and disability are constantly reasons that aren't actually incorporated into the justice system. And in particular with sexual assault, it's also based on medieval ideas about gender. The idea that a woman would regret sleeping with someone and then the best thing they can do is cry rape rather than just not telling anyone. Like in a modern day and age where women have autonomy over their sexuality, where we're in a dating age and there's choices to be made, it doesn't even make rational sense that someone would do that just because they regret sleeping with someone.
And do you think that women barristers, like the one in Prima Facie, play that gendered role? I mean, do they attack women as if they're men?
Well, what happens is that the way to be a defence lawyer is to do that. There's no other way except to not so much attack but undermine that evidence. And what happens is with sexual assault cases is that because what your role as a lawyer, barrister, solicitor to do is to only give the best version of your client's story. That's all your role is. You're not judging anyone. That's up to the system to judge. So you play a very small role, which is to tell the story of your client in the best way possible so the court can hear the best version of their story. And in order to do that, you also, I guess, cross-examine the other story to see where the gaps might be, where it doesn't make sense. So, and what happens, of course, is if you've been accused of sexual assault or rape as a man, the optics are great to have a female defence barrister or a female defence lawyer. So women are, I guess, uncommonly expected to do that work because they're the first ones people brief if you've actually got a defendant who's a man and who's been accused of sexual assault. Now, what's really interesting about the book and the story that I wrote is that all the women barristers that read it that do that work, and actually the character says it in the novel, you don't realise, because you're so busy being part of the system and towing the line of the system, you don't realise that maybe you're part of the problem when you're in it. And of course, I'm part of the problem myself when I was in it. You know, obviously we all have been brought up by a patriarchal system that has certain ingrained ideas that we've grown up with. We've all grown up with an idea of a legal system that's been defined by very wealthy white men and very able-bodied white men. And so we've actually just accepted that and tried to sort of reform it into what a modern society is, but it's very much lagging in terms of its perspective because up until relatively recently there weren't really women judges as well, or people of colour who were judges. Now that's changing in Britain, definitely, and the Old Bailey, I'm so delighted to say, has parity of gender. So when it comes, and what's interesting to me is I've had many reach outs by judges who have affected massive change after this story, and the ones that have reached out to me in London at the Old Bailey are women. And interestingly, though, recently I went and did a book launch of the book in Liverpool because that's where the character comes from. And sitting there, I had a question from the audience. There's quite a lot of people there. And I could tell straight away that it was someone who was either a barrister or a judge. And I said, I can tell you're a lawyer. And of course, he said, well, that's stereotyping me. But I thought, I know because I've worked in the industry. I know exactly what the uniform is. And as I write in the book, I sort of go behind the scenes to tell you all the secrets of what's happening at the bar. And he came up to me afterwards and said, I am a judge, actually. And he quoted, some of my words to me and said, we really want this to be a story that judges read here as well.
So your character, who I can only think of as Jodie Comer.
Well, actually, Jodie Comer did it here and she won the Tony and the Olivier. But, there's 20 different productions of this in Germany alone at the moment, but all over the world. I mean, it's all up and down South America. It's all over Europe. It's in all the English-speaking countries. America's had Jodie there, but who knows who's going to do it in the future.
So totally tapped into something that people recognise immediately.
Yeah, and it's not just white women doing it either, which I think is really the next conversation, and it's important to say Jodie was the first person that did it. And because she has such clarity and such sort of acceptance by the community, and people love Jodie as an actor and as a young woman that's come from not the kind of London vibe.
Yeah, from Liverpool. And,
so I feel like, she was very important in terms of that first production and she does the audiobook for the book as well. Because I think that it was like, we love this character. We're seeing her being a bit arrogant, being a little bit, we're seeing her flaws and her sort of personality and her kind of being a bit proud of herself because she won a case. And then when we see what happens to her, I think the audience really go, oh, wow, now I see it from the other side.
But what is the significance of her being a working class?
Well, to me, there's a really big significance. Yeah. So the thing is that I wanted to look at the intersection of different things, not just gender, but gender with something. And so I've looked at class because I think that's a really important and sometimes invisible one. Less invisible in Britain, I have to say, because of accents that vary from region to region. But for a working class kid that's actually ended up going to a posh university and done well and got to the height of the bar, I was one of those kids. I basically didn't have parents that were educated. But for me, it was like, wow, I really believe in the law because it's accepted me despite that. And how amazing. So you have a great belief system in the system itself and you want it to work because it's the thing you've invested your life in, and you really do invest and you study everybody else and you're very much trying to make sure that you can, dance backwards in high heels for the whole of your life like Ginger Rogers. But, that idea of thinking, wow, I've made it, I've got here, this is incredible, I really want to, I believe in this system, I want it to work. And if you're a human rights lawyer or you're a defence barrister, The thing with being in defence is that you want to believe it works because you need to go to the edge of the line when you're telling your client's story. You have to go right to the edge and use everything you have. And in order to do that, you have to have faith that the system works. So when you suddenly see the system as something that's not working, and once you see it, you can't unsee it, you then think, I don't know if I want to dance that close to the edge anymore. I don't know if I want to tell the story in such a manner that's so persuasive because I've got a bit of an unfair advantage here.
So tell us about the reaction, because it's been remarkable. And what's especially remarkable is that it kind of takes a play for people to come forward and go, yes, that's right.
Yeah, I think it was amazing to me. I mean, when I wrote this play, it's a one-woman show about a lawyer that gets raped. It's basically very humorous in parts. Try and sell that to a theatre company. You think, even as I wrote it in a hot passion of thinking, this is what I've been trying to say to people all my life, because I've been to those dinner parties where they say, yes, but how can you act for someone who you know is guilty? And I mean, in the book I say that, well, Tessa explains, your job is not to know, it's to not know. It's to actually put the best version of your client's story forward so that they have as much chance of justice before the law as anybody else. And if the system can't cope with that and find the right way forward, then there's a mistake. But the other thing is that recognising that the system, even though we call it a legal system and we call it a justice system, really what it's doing is putting checks and balances in place so we never send anyone to prison who is innocent. So, people go to the courts and go to the legal system to try and find justice and fairness, but it's not necessarily going to deliver that. And I think we need to talk to the community about what the system actually does. It's not necessarily about if you don't win in your case, that doesn't mean you're lying or your story is not true. It means it didn't reach the very high level we have before we deny someone their liberty.
So what has actually changed as a result?
Okay, some amazing things have changed in terms of, from me as, first of all, in Australia we had huge forums where we had only women who were trained in law come to a Q&A after the show, and now I'm doing barrister groups with the book. And basically one thing I learnt from that was this is women's workplace. And I always thought that women who were sort of that well-educated and that sort of established, really, why would they not speak up? But then, of course, you realise that once you've actually gone to the bar as a woman, the struggle to get there, what you've given up to get there in terms of you've got university fees, you've studied like crazy, you've got less time with your family, you've had your children, they're in childcare, you've worked your way up, you get to a position at the bar, and to disclose something like that about a colleague means that all of those people, which are mainly men, they're not going to actually attach you to their case, and they're not going to say it's because we're a bit scared you're going to accuse us of something. They're going to say you're not good enough because they can. And so, or the message to the rest of the bar is the reason you're not getting work is because you're not good enough, not because, well, you made that accusation and you freaked everyone out that maybe they're scared they'll have a similar accusation. So a lot of the women that I spoke to said, this happens in our workplace, but we would, why would you give up 20 years worth of debt and all the things you've done to get there and the family that you've really compromised to be there, and then make a disclosure that on the balance of it, no one's going to really believe you against a senior barrister or so forth. So I thought that was really interesting. That was an insight for me because I hadn't thought of that actually, because I wasn't, that was a very senior role. But and all the women judges were there, and I had women who were like absolute die-hard, like criminal defence lawyers who only do sexual assault, and one of them put up her hand and said, well, I'd just like to say that if it was my niece or my goddaughter, I'd say never go to court, because if you do, you'll have someone like me cross-examining, and I can guarantee you I can undermine you.
Yeah.
And so you think, well, there's something wrong then if that's the case. Like, that's why women aren't reporting. And so you have to delve a bit deeper than the law, because the law is a reflection of our community. So what are we doing in our community to actually, I guess, interrogate that patriarchal idea?
But do you think the system being what it is, there are refinements that can be made and are being made? I mean, they are being made in terms of the summing up and the way judges interpret.
Well, that's
evidence.
One of the things that happened is that the summing ups that they do, one of the judges called me and said, I'm the person that writes the summing up for the judges to read to the jury. And after I saw this story, I thought I have to change it. I've rewritten it overnight, and I now call it my Prima Facie summing up, which is the name of the book. And basically people have been quoting that summing up to me ever since. And so all over England, they read that summing up, which basically says just because someone doesn't remember their evidence in a clear-cut, logical, kind of fashion and maybe they miss certain peripheral details, it doesn't mean they're lying. It might mean that they're traumatised by what happened to them. And I think that's really important because that's one way that defence lawyers really undermine someone who's in the box. And if they're giving evidence in the witness stand and they're a complainant, they might not remember the colour of the peripheral light, or they might not get it in the right order. It might not be in the same time span that they initially thought it was. And so those things are confounding, but they know what happened to them and they know who did it.
I mean, does it make you... I mean, this applies, beyond rape and sexual assault, doesn't it?
It does, but I think it's particularly for this area because it's different to other crimes, as in if you're the victim of a violent crime, you're required not only to have a consistent understanding of what happened to you, but to have the sort of recall that I don't think anyone could possibly have if they're being at the same time as sort of trying to fight for their life. The other thing is that what we realise now is that the male response to violence is to fight or flight. And so that's a very strong reaction to being intimidated or to being under threat. But when women are under threat by someone physically bigger than them, to fight or flight is not a survival tactic. It's actually something that could actually, because you're not going to outrun or outfight someone that's that much bigger than you. And so what women do is they freeze or they befriend. So it's the other two Fs. You either friend someone or you freeze. And they're legitimate survival tactics for women who are under distress and trying to survive. But they've never been included. So often someone would be cross-examined saying, did you kick? Did you scream? Did you try to run away? And often women will go, I froze, and they feel so ashamed that they froze. But actually psychologists now recognise that as a completely valid survival tactic when you're in that scenario and you realise you can't get away.
But does it also make you question the sort of the fundamental adversarial nature of justice in which, are we really trying to get to the truth, or are we just trying to get to something that is...
Well, I think that's a really good question because I think the general public think we're trying to get to the absolute truth. And one of the things that I say in the book is that really what they're trying to get to is the legal truth. So can it be proven beyond this particular standard? If it can't be, then it's not something that we're going to deal with in a punishment or sentence. So I think that's what people don't understand. So they get so disillusioned by the legal system. So and also they'll say, this person did this and that, and then they didn't get found guilty in court. And you go, well, the evidence wasn't at the standard that it needs to be for a criminal conviction, and in many ways, I guess a civilised society is based on people that don't put innocent people in prison or have some sort of standard to make sure they don't go to prison. The difference is with sexual assault, with a conviction rate of 1.3%, despite the incidents I've explained, is that it's out of whack with the community.
And do you have a better way to do it?
I think there's lots of different ways of doing it. First of all is actually enacting things like this, which is one of the things is that this judge wrote a different summing up, the Prima Facie, that she used some of the words from language from my book. And then the other thing is one of the other judges has actually made it mandatory viewing for judges who are going to hear sexual assault cases to see a film of the play so that they understand the other side of the other story. And I think because the character is a lawyer that goes to give evidence, she also has a moment at the end of the book and at the end of the play where she talks about this is not working anymore and something has to change. And I think that some of the changes are we can look at how we support victims of any sort of crime, but particularly sexual assault when they're actually dealing with the person that was their perpetrator in court. We can consider having specialist sexual assault courts, so there's actually a psychiatrist that can be called for expert evidence.
Have politicians been talking to you at all?
Absolutely. And also one of the great things that happened is a group of barristers who work in and out of the Old Bailey and the inner city courts in London courts have put together a group, and the character's name in the book is Tessa, and they've called the group Tessa, and basically the acronym, because lawyers love a bit of language play, is the examination of serious sexual assault. So they're looking over all of the legislation, which hasn't been changed in 20, 30 years, and they're actually interrogating that to see if they can put some models forward that will make them feel good about being able to run a case of sexual assault defence without thinking that they're part of the problem themselves by being the people that do it, that run the cases. And I think that's really interesting because, I don't blame anyone for taking the cases they take, but I think we're all a small part of a bigger system. And sometimes when you're in the system, it's the best place to enact change. And like these judges that have put in place, different summing up that they've put in place, that judges in Northern Ireland must watch a video of the play so that before they can sit on a rape case. I mean, these are big changes, and I think that they come from women within the system who've actually put forward those possibilities.
But where does that leave the defence then? If you can't use all your current weapons?
Well, I think some of the current weapons are exactly that. They're weapons. They're not actually ways of actually asking questions in a fair mode. And, in every other sort of case, in so many other cases, if someone proves that they weren't consenting, then there's some obligation surely on the other part of the other part in that process to say why they believed they were consenting. To just be able to be completely silent and just undermine the case of the female. I know the right to silence exists, and I'm a big believer in that as well, but I think this is a particular area of law, and I'm not saying that's the only way, but I think we need to look at all the different possibilities. I will be a defence person through and through as a defence lawyer because I believe in the right to, that innocence until proven guilty. But until you actually have a sense that the rules are fair, it's very hard to sort of to agree that sexual assault and rape law are being run in a manner that's not behind community expectations.
But are you saying that right now defence lawyers should hold back from well, suppose the case in your story is
yes.
He's holding two hands, so how could he have the hand over your mouth?
Yeah.
Now,
oh, you've read it.
Spot that,
I'm so moved.
If you spot that inconsistency, are you saying, well, you shouldn't point it out because actually
No, I'm saying you absolutely should. But I think that the jury needs to be told that that might not have as much weight as other things that the witness has said. So I think I think that defence lawyers, they should do their job the way they do their job, but the system needs to tell them where they get reined in. And the system at the moment hasn't done that so far. And the summing ups to juries haven't included that idea that sometimes consistency is not always equal to truth. So, and lack of consistency does not always mean someone's lying. It might mean somebody's actually traumatised.
And just as a slight sidebar issue, but seeing as it's come up, I mean, on the whole question of sort of the cases that lawyers take.
Yeah.
I mean, Keir Starmer's under attack politically right now for the cases, the people he's defended in the past. And his explanation is, well, we have a system in which everybody has a right to a defence.
Absolutely, and I would be on his team entirely.
You agree with that?
I do, because the cab rank rule exists here, as it does in Australia, as it does in various countries, not all over the world though. And that cab rank rule exists because if you are working in criminal law and you have an expertise in a particular area and someone calls up and your diary's free, you have an expectation, like a cabbie at the airport, to take that case. And the reason for that is so everyone gets good representation. And I think that is the bedrock of how you keep a society civilised, is that you don't say those people don't deserve a defence. Everyone deserves a defence. Any of us today could be accused of something and then brought before the court and judged by the media, which is sort of all out in terms of judging at the moment. So you sort of go, you want it to be done in a systemic way and in a systematic way with a methodology that at least we all agree upon. And I'm just saying that there's always room for law reform, and I think particularly in the area of sexual assault and rape, if it's stopping people coming forward because it just feels like such an intimidating process and that you're going to be so undermined in that process and then you'll probably lose anyway. And, even the process to get there, one of the great things is that there was a workshop in northern Yorkshire with 3,000 police officers, and I got all these messages from the police officers saying, thank you for the story, because I had one guy that wrote to me and said, I've done this for 30 years and it's not until I read this that I realised that I've been doing it wrong. And now I'm giving you my affirmation that when I take statements in the future, I won't be coming from a perspective, this is useless, they're never going to get over the line. And I will recognise that someone's traumatised while they're sitting in front of me relaying an event of the previous night or something. And rather than just thinking, this is going to take forever and it's a waste of time because half of them don't follow through, I will give it that time and effort and that support so that person doesn't feel like the questions I'm asking them means I'm doubting them. Because even when someone discloses to their parents, one of the first things even women will say is, but why did you wear that outfit? Or why did you go back to his house? As if that's an invitation for a violent sex act. And it's not. Women are...
Well, I was going to say, you've deliberately sort of chosen a sort of a scenario in which
Yeah.
it's only, I guess in relatively recent years that everybody would recognise that as a rape.
Even now, though, people don't necessarily, which is a shock. I had 14-year-old boys.
Because she's back at her house
Yes.
and she's had sex with him already consensually.
And then she doesn't feel well and she doesn't want to do it again, but it's pushed to the nth degree and it becomes something that's just really violent for her. And I think that, I had 14-year-old boys see the play, and a group of them with a school group, and one of them was so excited to get an autograph afterwards, but said, I didn't even know that was rape. And I thought, well, therein lies the problem. And one of the great things we've got happening now is this thing called the Schools Consent Project, which is actually going out to schools to explain what consent is to children. And I think not just to children, but to young adults. And, even myself, like you'd say to a boy, do you know what consent is? And they go, yeah, no means no. And I go, not just no. Other things mean no too, and they're like, oh, what do you mean? And the other thing is that, it's yes means yes. And so this idea of the affirmative consent model where you actually say, is this okay? Or do you want this? It's not a big ask.
I mean, it's very refreshing to talk to an artist who says, I do this because I want to change the way people think. Because a lot of artists say, oh, well, I just tell stories or I just do what I do and then whatever
I guess I do it because I can't say it in enough words. I can say it in stories, but, I know because I tried to change people's minds at dinner parties long enough that, everyone would sort of fade at a certain point. She's talking about the law or she's talking about a system or she's talking about something. But if you actually tell a story and, you draw people in, and I think that's the gift that storytellers have, and you can use it to make people laugh, you can do it to make people cry, you can do it to change the world, or for all three things, which that's my aim, is to try and do all three things.
And are you now drawn, as the fashion is, to the mini-series, the box sets?
Oh, right, yeah. I mean, everyone
as a
is,
screenwriter rather than a playwright.
Well, I do both, definitely. And, theatre will always be my first and primary love, but so will novel writing. This novel came about because when I wrote the play, I had so much that I had to take out to actually make it 90 minutes on stage. And I thought one day I'm going to write the book of this. And the journey into the book was being able to absolutely excavate the character's psychological landscape and really give you the voice of a woman in this scenario.
Do you find yourself wanting to go where the audience are?
I really do want to go where audiences are. I feel like my primary source is in your home in a book form, or going as an audience, like shoulder to shoulder with other people assembling in a theatre.
It's also just as a slight dogleg again. It's also been part of this trend in theatre now to get big stars doing one-man or woman shows. Filling theatres, and they're really appealing for audiences because you go, I want to go see Jodie Comer or Billy Crudup or whoever it might be. But it's kind of changing theatre as well because it's turning it into star-led.
Well, the West End's always pretty much had names on stage because as the commercial reality is you can't sell tickets to that exorbitant number, as in, I don't mean price-wise, although they're expensive, particularly on Broadway. But in terms of the numbers on seats, in terms of the numbers per night, in order to have a West End theatre, you need to have that desire to see not only a spectacle on stage and a story on stage, but an actor that you really care about seeing on stage. But, it's interesting to me because before I wrote Prima Facie, I didn't really know of that many one-people shows with stars on stage. And I guess...
And now they're everywhere.
Yeah, well, it's sort of interesting to me. But, Fleabag I knew about. That was one that I knew about that started small and sort of took over the world in a way and then became television.
And finally, if you could change the world in any way, how would you change it?
Do you know, I would... This is really over the top, but I just would love to have the idea of groups of people that are kind of roving peace brokers. The idea that, when something flares up in countries, that there's some commitment by all of us to saying there'll be some form of mediation that's actually real mediation where there's the real commitment to actually not going to war. I feel like we've actually lost that capacity to think of it in terms of human people that are being killed when we do go into conflict, and it's innocent people that are being killed in conflict of all sorts, all around the world. But I just sort of feel like, how are we still doing this? It's like it's something out of the beginning of Shakespeare, these sorts of wars, and we're still doing that to resolve conflict about territory, conflict about oil. It just doesn't make sense, and there's no rational sense to that anymore, and how we're still doing it. I think more women involved.
Suzie Miller, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. It's been such a joy.